The plane had already touched down. It hadn't fallen out of the sky. It hadn't broken apart in the air. It was sliding along the runway, bleeding off speed, and it should have come to a stop. Out of 181 people on board, 2 would survive. How did an accident that should have been survivable turn into the deadliest disaster in South Korean history? Jeju Air Flight 7 Charlie 2216, a Boeing 737-800, the morning of the 29th of December, 2024, the regional airport of Muan. A flock of ducks in both engines. Landing gear that never came down. 4 minutes recorded by not a single instrument, and an argument that hasn't died down to this day. Who was to blame? The birds, the pilots, or a concrete wall that should never have been there beyond the runway? Let's go through it minute by minute. On the 29th of December, 2024, an ordinary passenger jet was descending through the morning sky over the southwest of South Korea. Jeju Air Flight 7 Charlie 2216, a Boeing 737-800, was inbound from Bangkok to Muan, a small regional airport of which there are only a handful in the country. The overnight flight was nearly over. On board were 181 people, 175 passengers, and 6 crew members. Many were heading home after the holidays. Only a few minutes remained before touchdown, and up to that moment, there was nothing in the flight that would have raised an eyebrow for anyone on the ground. The crew received clearance to land. The weather was calm, visibility was good, the aircraft was sound. Approaches like this happen thousands of times a day all over the world. That only makes what came next harder to wrap your head around. In the space of 4 minutes, a routine landing would become the worst aviation disaster in the history of South Korea. And right away there's one question that runs through this whole story, to the very end. The trouble that set everything in motion was the kind that people walk away from. A plane with no thrust, coming down without landing gear. That's terrifying, but it's not a death sentence. Landings like that have happened, and people have survived. So why did almost everyone die here? The answer turns out not to be where they look for it in those first hours. Not in the sky, not in the engines, not in the actions of the pilots alone. What killed those people wasn't the touchdown itself, but what stood just past the end of the runway. A low, utterly unremarkable structure that takeoffs and landings had passed by for years. To understand how this happened, we have to take apart the entire chain. The aircraft, the crew, the birds, the failed systems, and the concrete. Let's start with the plane. The machine coming in to land that morning was neither brand new nor a wreck. The Boeing 737-800, with registration HL8088, rolled off the assembly line in 2009. 15 years is an ordinary age for an airliner. With proper maintenance, these aircraft fly for 25, even 30 years. The jet first served the Irish low-cost carrier Ryanair. Then in 2017, it passed to Jeju Air, Korea's largest budget airline. By the time of the disaster, this fuselage had thousands of takeoffs and landings across Asia behind it. Under the wings sat 2 CFM56 engines, the offspring of a Franco-American consortium, and quite possibly the most widely produced aircraft engine in history. Tens of thousands of these motors have lifted entire generations of 737s into the air. Their reputation is a benchmark of reliability. Keep that in mind. A story in which the engines fail begins with some of the most proven motors in the world. It's worth saying a few words about the airline itself. Jeju Air appeared in 2005 and grew into Korea's largest budget carrier, a classic low-cost operator, making its money on a tight schedule and fast aircraft turnaround. By the time of the disaster, its fleet consisted almost entirely of Boeing 737-800s, dozens of identical jets, exactly like the one coming into Muan that morning. Its route network stretched across Japan, Southeast Asia, and domestic Korea. The airline had no major crashes on its record before this, and for millions of passengers it was an ordinary, cheap, familiar name on a ticket. The intensity of operations was also typical for a low-cost carrier. In the 2 days before the disaster, the aircraft flew 13 flights, heavy but within limits. The economics of budget airlines rest on exactly that kind of rapid rotation. The plane barely sits idle on the ground. The pre-flight check, according to the airline, came back with no issues. No deferred defects, no alarming entries in the logbook that would come to light later. In the cockpit sat experienced people. The captain joined Jeju Air in 2019 with more than 6,800 flight hours behind him, of which over 6,000 were on 737s. The first officer had logged more than 1,600 hours. Not cadets, not fresh graduates. Both men knew their aircraft. And a picture comes together that makes your skin crawl. A sound, well-worn airplane, reliable engines, an experienced crew, a calm morning. Where could a disaster possibly come from here? The first jolt would come not from the cockpit and not from the machinery, but from the outside, from the land and the sky around Muan. Muan has a particular feature that people in aviation circles knew about long before the 29th of December. The airport was built on the southwestern coast, right at the edge of the sea, beside tidal mudflats and marshes. For people, it's a scenic place. For aviation, it's a constant threat. Land like this draws migratory birds by the thousands. That geography is its own painful storyline. The southwestern coast of Korea lies directly on the path of one of the largest migration corridors in East Asia. Every winter, hundreds of thousands of waterfowl gather here, including the very Baikal teal that bunch up into enormous flocks. Several of the estuaries closest to the airport are protected habitats. The airport opened in 2007. The site was chosen for its convenient coastal plain and the region's development plans. And the birds, as the 29th of December would show, weighed far too little in those plans. The numbers back this up in advance. By bird strike statistics, Muan was the worst of the country's 14 regional airports. The bird strike rate here reached almost 0.1% of departures, a record for Korea, several times higher than at major hubs like Incheon. Ornithologists and regulators had said more than once, putting a runway next to wintering grounds for birds is a risk built into the very design of the airport. That morning, Flight 2216 was approaching the runway on heading 01. At 8:54, the crew received clearance to land, a routine command, a standard phrase. 3 minutes later, at 8:57, the controller passed a warning. Risk of a bird strike in the approach area. This wasn't panic, and it wasn't an emergency cue. Warnings like that are common at Muan. But on this particular morning, there really was a flock over the runway. And here a detail surfaces that would later raise a lot of questions. The airport known as the worst for birds was, at the moment of the disaster, covered more thinly than it should have been. Bird control, blank round gunfire, specialized equipment patrolling the zone, was supposed to be staffed by several people per regulation. One person was on duty, a single employee for the entire airfield, notorious for its flocks. Could the birds have been driven off in time? Could the crew have been warned earlier, or more forcefully? Those questions would remain in the investigation files. But in real time, the pilots had not minutes left, but seconds. The plane was descending, the flock was ahead, and the controller's warning came almost at the same instant as what happened next. A human being is nearly powerless to react to something like that. A few moments after the warning, the jet flew straight into the birds. The collision lasts a fraction of a second, but it changes everything. The birds slam, all at once, into the air intakes. An engine is a set of blades spinning at enormous speed, and a dense mass drawn into a running motor can knock it out. On Flight 2216, both engines were hit at once. That's a rarity. More often, birds strike just one. Here, the flock covered the plane in such a way that both the left and the right motor took damage. Laboratory analysis would later answer exactly what was in the engines. DNA testing would identify the species, the Baikal teal, a migratory duck. Biological traces of this species would be found in both air intakes. This isn't a guess from the wreckage, but a genetically confirmed fact. The crew reacted instantly. At 8:58 and 56 seconds, less than 2 minutes after the controller's warning, a mayday went out from the aircraft, the international distress signal. The pilots broke off the approach and went around, climbing away from the runway to buy time and assess the state of the machine. The damage turned out to be asymmetrical. The right engine was badly hit. The left was relatively intact. It had taken a blow, but by the available data, it was still producing thrust. And here, the story takes an important turn. A plane with one working engine is not a catastrophe. The 737-800 is designed to fly and land on a single motor. Crews practice failures like that in the simulator. Having lost one power plant, the pilots are required to keep control and bring the machine in to land, and usually they manage it. So at this stage, Flight 2216 still had a chance. A working engine, an experienced crew. The trouble is that what comes next is a stretch that not a single instrument recorded. When investigators got to the flight recorders, they were met by an anomaly that would define the entire later argument over the causes. Every modern airliner carries two black boxes: the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, which captures conversations and sounds in the cockpit, and the flight data recorder, the FDR, which logs hundreds of flight parameters: altitude, speed, control positions, engine operation. These are the chief witnesses to any disaster. But in the case of Flight 2216, both witnesses fell silent early. The recordings cut off about 4 minutes before impact. Both the CVR and the FDR stopped almost simultaneously. And that's no longer a single instrument failing, but a sign of something bigger. The most likely explanation from the specialists: a complete loss of electrical power on board, including the backup sources. If the plane lost both its main and its emergency electrical supply, the recorders simply stopped receiving current and writing data. And into that window of silence fits everything that mattered: what the crew did with the engines, how the system failure unfolded, why the landing gear never came down, how the pilots brought the machine in to the second runway. About that exact stretch, the investigation has neither voices from the cockpit nor recorded parameters. The FDR itself was found partly damaged. According to the investigation, the recorder had no connector between the memory module, the part where the data is stored, and the power system. In other words, the physical contact through which flight parameters fed into the protected memory was missing entirely. And that explained why the recording could have cut off so abruptly. The memory module itself survived, but without that connection, the information couldn't be pulled from it by standard means. Korea couldn't extract the data on its own. Both recorders were sent across the ocean, to the laboratory of the United States National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, one of the most authoritative aviation accident investigation bodies in the world. The Americans were involved for good reason. The aircraft is a Boeing, and under international ICAO rules, the state of the manufacturer gets the right to take part in the investigation. The manufacturers joined in on their own parts as well: Boeing for the airframe and systems, the Franco-American CFM International for the engines. In the NTSB laboratory, specialists manually restored the readout of the damaged unit and confirmed the version of the recorders going silent in sync, and therefore of the aircraft being fully powered down during those very 4 minutes. So a blind spot formed at the very heart of the story. The investigators know what came before it and what came after, but what was happening inside those 4 minutes has to be reconstructed from indirect traces, from wreckage, from fuel valves, from models. And it's in that darkness that the most disputed finding of the whole investigation would be born. The gravest accusation in this story concerns not the birds and not the concrete, but the people in the cockpit. According to the investigation, in the final seconds before the recorders went silent, the captain gave the command to shut down engine number 2, the right one, the very motor that had been badly damaged by the birds. The logic here is clear. You shut down a broken motor so it doesn't catch fire and create extra problems, and you hold on to the sound one. But from there, the investigation ran into something that doesn't add up. When the wreckage was examined, it emerged that the fuel valve had been closed on engine number 1, on the left, on the very engine that was considered relatively intact and was still producing thrust. If that's so, the picture that forms is an alarming one. Instead of the damaged engine, at some moment the fuel supply was cut off to the working one, and that means the plane lost the last power plant still keeping it in the air. This could explain that very total loss of electrical power and the simultaneous stopping of both recorders. Here we need to stop and say it plainly. This is the version of the investigating body, the ARAIB, not a proven fact, and a fierce argument flared up around it. The command to shut down engine number 2 is recorded before the recording cuts off. But what happened with the fuel valves in the following minutes, in that very blind spot? There's no direct data. The investigation can link the command on one engine to the closed valve on the other only indirectly, reconstructing events from the wreckage. The crew's defenders object. Under that kind of load, with 2 damaged engines and a cascade of failures, drawing a flat conclusion that the pilots mixed up the motors is premature. Other explanations for the state of the valves are possible, from the force of the impact to the quirks of how the systems behave in an unpowered aircraft. An important argument in this dispute was given by the engine manufacturer as well. CFM International, whose CFM56 motors were on the aircraft, examined the state of the power plants together with the investigation. According to information that reached the press, the inspection showed that the left engine, the one to which, by the investigation's version, the fuel was cut off, had not been wrecked by the birds badly enough to quit on its own. If a working motor stopped not from damage, the question arises, what stopped it? The investigation's version answers, the closed valve. Boeing, for its part, as the maker of the airframe and systems, took part in the investigation and provided data on the design, but made no public statements about the crew's guilt. Neither the aircraft manufacturer nor the engine manufacturer has officially confirmed the version of a fatal pilot error. So, at the center of the investigation lay a question with no clean answer. Was this a fatal human error or a hasty conclusion by an investigation that pinned the blame on those who can no longer answer for themselves? We'll come back to that argument. But first, one more failure. At 9 o'clock, the crew comes back on the radio. Having gone around, the pilots ask for clearance to land in the opposite direction, to come in no longer on runway 01, but on 19 from the other side. Behind that decision is a desperate arithmetic. The aircraft is losing capability. There's almost no time, and the approach from the opposite side is shorter. A minute later, at 9:01, the controller gives clearance, and to this moment belongs one of the most inexplicable details of the entire disaster. The landing gear never came down. In the footage of the approach, which would later go around the world, the 737 heads for the runway with its struts retracted. Neither the nose gear nor the main gear. The plane is about to land on its belly. Why? There's still no precise answer to this day. The investigation's main version ties it to that same bird strike. The damage could have disrupted the hydraulics responsible for extending the gear, and for the manual emergency extension. On the 737, it's done with cables, by hand, and takes time. The crew no longer had that time. From Mayday to touchdown, about 4 minutes passed. But here, the experts throw up their hands. A simultaneous failure of all 3 struts is an atypical picture. The landing gear on the 737 is built so that, on loss of pressure, it can drop down under its own weight. The complete and simultaneous non-deployment of all 3 legs requires an explanation that doesn't yet exist, and it, too, is hidden in those 4 blind minutes. To the landing gear problem, one more was added. The flaps, the movable panels on the trailing edge of the wing, extended before landing to fly slower and more stably, also stayed retracted. Without them, the plane heads for the runway at a noticeably higher speed than in a normal landing. The combination that results is a brutal one. The machine heads for the ground with no gear, no flaps, fast and bare. Each of these failures on its own the crew might perhaps have countered. Together, with time running out and most likely without engines, they left less and less choice. One option remained, to land the plane as it was. At 9:03, the Boeing 737 touches the concrete of the runway with its fuselage. Not its wheels, there are none, but its belly itself. The point of contact comes at roughly 1,200 meters down the runway, that is, far from the very threshold and already closer to the middle. And that's bad. The later the plane touches the runway, the less length remains to bleed off speed and stop. A belly landing in itself is not a death sentence. Aviation history has plenty of cases where a crew put a jet down without landing gear and the passengers walked away alive. But here everything worked against Flight 2216. Without flaps, the approach speed was higher than a normal landing speed. Without gear, there was no shock absorption and no way to brake with the wheels. The machine settled onto the runway and tore down it, sliding on the metal of its fuselage in a shower of sparks. The main brake in a situation like this is thrust reverse, a device that turns the flow from the engines backward and bleeds off speed. But the reverser only works while the engines work, and by the moment of touchdown, Flight 2216 had at best one of them running, if it had any at all. According to the available data, the reverser deployed on only one side. That's incomplete asymmetrical braking, and there was almost nothing left to slow an already sliding machine. The runway at Muan had been shortened during construction. Instead of the original 2,800 meters, it was brought to 2,500. The authorities later denied that this affected the outcome, but for a fast plane with practically nothing to brake with, the length margin still wasn't enough. The machine wasn't going to stop within the runway. It slid toward its end, and beyond that end waited what should never wait at a normal airport. Ahead was no flat safety area and no open field. Ahead was concrete. 250 meters past the end of the runway stood an earthen embankment. Hidden inside it was a concrete structure, the base for the antennas of the landing system. Mounted on it was the localizer, part of the ILS equipment by whose signal aircraft hold their direction on approach, a useful and necessary thing. The problem wasn't the antennas, but what they stood on. The height of the obstacle, the embankment together with the concrete base and the equipment, was about 4 meters, a low but solid wall of earth and concrete, directly in the path of planes rolling out. The sliding jet shot past the threshold of the runway and slammed into that embankment at speed. The impact against the massive concrete barrier shattered the plane's structure all at once. A fire flared up, an explosion thundered. What a second earlier had been a controlled, if emergency landing, turned into a catastrophe. Out of 181 people on board, 2 survived. Both were flight attendants, seated in the very rear of the fuselage. On impact, the tail tore away from the main structure and flew off to the side, and that's what saved the 2 of them. Rescuers found them alive among the wreckage and evacuated them quickly. Both suffered serious injuries. 179 people died. So Flight 2216 became the deadliest aviation disaster in the entire history of South Korea. There was no question of an organized evacuation. After the explosion and fire, the front and middle sections of the fuselage were destroyed almost instantly, and getting people out of the cabin was already impossible. Hundreds of firefighters and rescuers were thrown at the scene, dozens of vehicles. The flames were beaten down as crews picked apart what was left of the plane. The rescue work quickly turned into a mournful task, the search for and recovery of the dead. Identification came hard. The identities of the dead were established by DNA and fingerprints, and that work dragged on for days. The authorities set up temporary centers for relatives right at the airport, where hundreds of families gathered. What made the tragedy especially heavy was who the dead were. Almost everyone on board was a Korean citizen, returning home after a vacation in Thailand during the winter holidays. Among them were whole families, parents with children, elderly couples flying together. Sometimes Flight 2216 took several people from a single family at once. A nationwide period of mourning was declared across the country. To grasp the scale of the tragedy, you have to put 2 things side by side. On one hand, an accident that, as we've seen, was in principle survivable. Belly landings had happened, and people had stayed alive. On the other, the near total death of everyone on board. The difference between those outcomes was created by the barrier beyond the runway. Not a fall from altitude, not a breakup in the air, not an engine fire, but 4 meters of earth and concrete in the path of an already landed machine. And then comes the question that would become central to everything that followed. The zone past the end of the runway is supposed to be clear. That's airfield safety basics. So why did a concrete embankment stand beyond the runway at Muan? In the first hours after the tragedy, all attention was fixed on the birds. The version read itself: a flock, 2 damaged engines, an emergency landing. A bird strike seemed an obvious and sufficient cause. But once specialists and journalists made out exactly what the plane had hit, the focus shifted, from the engines to the concrete past the threshold. Here, a global airfield safety standard comes into play. Any equipment that has to be placed in the zone where planes might roll out must be frangible. That is, built so that on impact it breaks apart and collapses, without inflicting fatal damage on the machine. Antennas, masts, supports near a runway are made exactly that way, so they crumple like cardboard rather than stop a jet like a concrete block. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, explicitly recommends both a clear end zone beyond the runway and frangible structures within it. It's worth explaining what that zone was supposed to be. Past the threshold of every runway, ICAO rules call for a RESA, a runway end safety area. The idea is simple. If a plane fails to brake and rolls past the runway, it should reach a flat, cleared patch where it bleeds off the rest of its speed and stops without disaster. The recommended length is on the order of 240 meters of clear space, and there must be no solid obstacles within it. At Muan, on exactly that stretch, at 250 meters, stood the embankment. Where there isn't room for a full RESA, there's an engineering solution, EMAS. It's a layer of light, crushable concrete before the end of the zone. The plane's wheels sink into it as into deep sand, and the machine quickly and gently bogs down, losing speed. Such beds have already saved dozens of jets all over the world. At Muan, there was neither a proper RESA nor EMAS. Instead of a zone that absorbs an impact, there stood the exact opposite, a hard concrete base that turned the equipment into a wall. The embankment and supports at Muan had been there since the airport opened. But the massive concrete slab, it turned out, had been poured into the base relatively recently, in 2023. That was what turned the ILS equipment into a solid barrier instead of a breakaway structure. The contrast with other airports proved stark. At Gimpo, Seoul's main domestic airport, the localizer antennas stand almost level with the ground. At Incheon, the country's largest international hub, the equipment rises above the ground by mere centimeters and is also made frangible. What at Muan became a wall, in other places is arranged so that a plane passes through it without being destroyed. From this moment, a second storyline appears, no less painful than the argument over the engines. If not for the concrete, how many people would have stayed alive? And just how decisive did that embankment really turn out to be? The answer would come not from words, but from calculations. In January 2026, a year after the tragedy, the results of a technical simulation commissioned through official channels reached the press. Engineers reproduced the rollout scenario of Flight 2216 and calculated what would have happened under different conditions past the threshold of the runway. The conclusion was harsh. If the embankment hadn't been there at all, or if it had been frangible, as the rules require, the passengers would have survived. All of them. This isn't the emotion of the families or a guess by journalists, but an engineering calculation. The plane was sliding along the ground, losing speed. On a flat safety area or through breakaway structures, it would have kept braking and stopped, with injuries, with damage, but without mass casualties. What killed people was precisely the hard barrier. In essence, the simulation moved the concrete embankment from an aggravating circumstance to the main cause of the deaths. The authorities reacted in the very first weeks, and that reaction itself became an indirect admission of the problem. The Ministry of Transport ordered an urgent inspection of every airport in the country for what stood beyond their runways, above all the bases of the ILS antennas. It turned out Muan was not the only one. Similar hard structures, concrete bases, and embankments under localizers were found at several other Korean airfields, including a number of regional ones. Following the inspections, a rebuilding program was announced. The concrete bases were to be torn out and replaced with frangible, breakaway supports, as the rules require. What had stood for years beyond a dozen runways began to be dismantled. In effect, an admission that the barriers past the threshold were a shared failing, not an isolated error. The official assessment of the Muan structure itself was changing too. In December 2025, the country's Anti-Corruption Commission acknowledged that the embankment violated the requirements on frangible supports. A structure that for years had been considered part of the airfield equipment was officially called a breach of safety standards. To this line is attached one more heavy episode. The man who once headed the corporation that runs the country's airports, and on whose watch the question of this barrier was decided, took his own life in January 2025, soon after the disaster. According to available information, he did so by his own hand. This proves no one's guilt and closes no questions, but it shows what pressure came crashing down on those caught up in the story of the embankment. And here, a contradiction arises that tears the whole investigation apart. On one hand, the calculations, by which people died because of a wall that should never have been there. On the other, the investigation's findings, pointing ever more insistently at pilot error. If the concrete barrier is to blame, why does the official version speak of the crew? That fault line became the main battlefront in the struggle over Flight 2216. The open clash came in the summer of 2025. In July, the investigating body, the ARAIB, held a closed briefing for the families of the dead, where the version of a wrongly shut-down engine was voiced for the first time. The investigation intended to take it further as well. A press conference was planned, a release prepared, and the reaction turned out not to be the one they expected. The families of the dead and the Jeju Air Pilots Union came out sharply against it. The complaint wasn't with the facts themselves, but with the placement of emphasis. They accused the ARAIB of pinning the blame prematurely on the crew, on people who can't defend themselves, while pushing the role of the concrete embankment into the background. For the relatives of the dead, this sounded like an attempt to designate the pilots as the guilty parties, and thereby shield those responsible for the deadly barrier beyond the runway. The union said the same. The engine version rests on indirect data and on that very blind spot where there's no recording. Under this pressure, the official announcement fell through. The press conference was canceled, the release withdrawn. The interim findings essentially hung in the air, voiced but not officially established and publicly disputed. The dispute rose to the level of the state. In December 2025, the country's parliament passed a law on an independent investigation of the disaster. Its very appearance is a sign that trust in the original course of the inquiry had been shaken, and that the families had won the right to a fresh, separate look at the causes. In the end, the story ran up against a question that's hard to answer honestly and in a single word. What killed Flight 2216? The birds, which set off the whole chain? The pilots, if they really did mix up the engines? Or the concrete, which turned an accident into a disaster with mass casualties? Each side sees its own main cause, and perhaps the truth is that there's no single cause here at all. There's a chain in which people would have survived each link on its own, but it's no longer up to them to put the final word on this argument. The final report on the disaster is expected in June 2026, which means that, as of this telling, the cause is officially not closed. It's important to keep that in mind. Everything that's been laid out here, established facts, the investigation's versions, and the positions of the sides, but not the final word. The very dragging out of the investigation became grounds for reproach. It overran the one-year deadline that international rules allot for at least an interim report, and some of the families doubt that the outcome will be full and honest. What remains open? A great deal. Why, after all, the landing gear never came down and the flaps never extended? What exactly was happening in those 4 blind minutes that not a single instrument recorded? And whose hand, and under what circumstances, cut the fuel to the wrong engine, if it even happened the way the investigation describes? There's no direct answer to these questions yet, and some of them may stay unanswered forever. But there's also what has been firmly established. The plane flew into a flock of migrating ducks, and both engines took the hit. This is confirmed by DNA. Past the threshold of the runway stood a concrete embankment that, by safety standards, should never have been there. And out of 181 people on board, 179 died. No one disputes these facts, and the main lesson can be heard already now, without waiting for the final report. The accident was set in motion for Flight 2216 by the birds, and possibly by a chain of decisions in the cockpit. But what made it deadly was a barrier that should never have been there. The machine was already rolling along the ground, bleeding off speed, and it ran into concrete. After Muan, the industry began talking about something that, in calm years, is rarely brought up. What lies beyond the end of every runway that passengers land on? How many more airfields around the world hide their concrete embankments past the threshold? And what has to change so that an accident you can survive doesn't turn into a disaster because of what stands a few hundred meters ahead?